Hey, folks. So I'm here with Ramiro Funes, who is one of the co-founders of Anti-Conquista, which is a very good YouTube channel, website, social media outlet, putting out a lot of good anti-imperialist content specifically related to Latin America. And Ramiro had suggested that we do a book talk where we talk about some of our favorite books that have influenced our political development. So we've each picked three books that we're going to talk about for the next 40 minutes or so. Ramiro, why don't you go first, and then I'll do one, and then you do one, and then I'll do one, and we'll go back and forth. Fun times.
What's up, Caleb? How's it going? Thanks again for having me on, and for shout out to everybody watching. Shout out to all of Caleb's viewers and listeners, and shout out to everybody who follows Anticonquista. And we definitely appreciate you giving us a space to put the word out there about Anticonquista. And I wanted to do a book chat with you because I think it's important for young people on the left who are tired of capitalism, imperialism, who have student debt, who are unemployed, to revisit the works of Marxism and Leninism, to study and to read, because so much of that has been lost. One of the things that I really appreciate from your lives and your discussions is the fact that you critique people who are only about movementism and only about going out to protest and doing this and that, and sort of not giving importance to reading and studying. And so that's sort of the reason why I think it's cool to bring back this idea of socialist book exchanges and book talks, because it's important, like Lenin said in his address to the young communists, we all have to learn. And so there are a few books in my political journey that have inspired me. And I want to just point out the first one that I want to mention. It was one of the first books that brought me into communism before I was a communist. So just to give you some background, so in college, I was part of a Latino fraternity. And at the time, I was really into respectability politics. And I was really into this idea of like work. I was more of a liberal back then, working within the system. And I joined this Latino fraternity, and I was on the history committee for our fraternity. We were writing a history book about the fraternity, and I discovered a member of the fraternity who had been hidden from us, who they didn't tell us was a member, and his name is Enrique Oltuski, and he's the author of this book called Mi Vida Clandestina, My Clandestine Life. And I found it interesting that I found this book online because I was researching my fraternity, and I was like, huh, it's so interesting that they didn't bring him up in our research discussions about the book about the fraternity. And it turns out this guy Enrique Oltuski, he was a Cuban revolutionary who fought alongside Che Guevara in the Cuban Revolution, and he was a student at the University of Miami, and he pledged my fraternity in 1954. And basically, what the book is about is his journey as a Cuban revolutionary, organizing college students at the University of Miami, who were kind of wealthy, better off. Enrique himself came from a Polish background. His family was part of the bourgeoisie in Cuba that was aligned with Fulgencio Batista. And he basically committed class suicide. He joined the revolutionaries. At the time, Miami was a hub for pro-communist views. It was the opposite of what it is today. In Miami in the early 50s, there was a lot of Cuban communists who were there organizing, supporting like the uprisings. And so this book, Mi Vida Clandestina, before I even became a communist, I looked into this book because of my fraternity, and I found out that he was a communist, and I got to read about his journey from living in the U.S. as a student and being trained to work for Shell, the company in Cuba. And the reason it's called My Clandestine Life is because after graduating, he moved to Cuba and he worked for a very prestigious U.S. company on the island, and he played a role in the revolution in terms of fundraising and working in the underground urban cells. When we hear about the Cuban Revolution, a lot of times we only see the image of the jungles, the mountains, and the guerrillas in the jungles fighting against Batista. But an equally important role in the Cuban Revolution was the role of the people working clandestinely in the urban centers who were fundraising, organizing, creating agitation propaganda. And so this book was one of the first ones to really introduce me to communism, and it's a really great read. I especially suggest it for anyone who, if college students who feel like they want to be part of a revolutionary process, um, because it has a very optimistic view. You know, he says that even though I could have had it all, I could have worked for the biggest U.S. companies in Cuba, I could have allied myself with Batista. I have revolutionary morals and ethics, and I stand by them. And so that's why this book I highly suggest it to anyone who's interested in reading like a casual memoir about communism. It's a really great book.
Very good. Great. I'll have to check it out. Is it only available in Spanish or in English as well?
It's actually in English. The
Oh,
title is
okay.
in Spanish. Yeah, it's called
Okay.
Vida Clandestina: My Life in the Cuban Revolution by Enrique Oltuski. And
Okay.
I think it's on Amazon.
Okay. Is it available in Spanish too?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Great. Both languages. Very good. Okay. Well, I have, I guess, a book that was originally published in Russian, which is the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union short course. This is obviously not the first edition of it. This is the reprint that was put out by Red Star Publishers. But this is the official history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the short version that was published in 1936. It was published around the time the Soviet Constitution of 1936 came out. And it officially goes over the history of the Bolshevik Party and Marxism in Russia. And it goes and shows the development and how, the revolutionary movement in Russia. First, you had the what they called the Narodniks, which were organizing among the peasantry and believed that peasant communes were the way to socialism in Russia. And the Narodniks didn't have much success. And so then after that, you had the terrorists, they were called, that believed that by bombing buildings and assassinating government officials, they could lead Russia to socialism, and that didn't work. And that Marxism was the third political movement that arose in Russia, and it came to Russia. Yuri Plekhanov, brought the ideology of Marxism to Russia and established the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, recruited Lenin and others, and then Lenin had the brilliance to transform Russian Marxism into a party of a new type that would engage in agitation and propaganda, and all the way up until the 1905 revolution and the 1917 events. And it goes into great detail about how the Bolsheviks organized. They had a newspaper called the Pravda, which means truth. And it was basically anonymous letters from workers describing the conditions in their factories. And people would read it everywhere. It's a very good book. The section in the book on dialectical materialism was written by Stalin personally. But it was written by a committee. A committee put the book together, and it ends with the 1936 Constitution of the Soviet Union, in which the Soviet Union declared it was a fully socialist country in 1936 after the completion of the first 5-year plan and the opening of the second 5-year plan. So it's a pretty good book in terms of understanding the Bolshevik Party, where they came from, how they developed, and how they came to be the party that could take power. One particularly interesting part is it goes over all the factions within the Bolsheviks in the early years of the revolution. How they had the purge, where everyone who joined the Bolsheviks after the revolution was kicked out and had to reapply for membership. The workers' opposition, which was like an anarcho-syndicalist grouping. The Trotskyite opposition, the Bukharinite opposition, and how kind of Stalin's role and the different debates within the Bolshevik Party, what they disagreed about, what they wanted to do. It shows the development of the Bolshevik Party from its early years up until the mid 1930s, when they were achieving real economic miracles. And I think for anyone who really wants to understand Marxism, Leninism, and the political movement that really defined the 20th century, it's an essential reading. It's an essential text, really. It's very, very important. So I would recommend it. And it's one of the most widely studied books. People think that if you want to understand Marx, you should just open up, Karl Marx's 18th Brumaire or his letters to Frederick Engels or something. But it's these textbooks that I like. They're very basic. They help you understand the ideas, and then you can dig into the original text after digging into the textbooks. It kind of gives you an overview, a summary, very clear language. And I recommend people check out textbooks like the History of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. So
Yeah, I remember a few years ago, Caleb, you actually gave me a copy of it, and I found that book to be extremely helpful. I think it's probably one of the best communist books out there in terms of teaching history and theory, the science of dialectics and materialism. And I'm so glad to have a copy of it because it's so rare to find a book that offers that unique Bolshevik perspective. I remember when I was first getting into communism and socialism, I would go to Barnes and Noble, and almost all of the books about Marxism was either pro Trotsky and completely smeared the Soviet Union the whole time, or was this kind of postmodern, critical theory, sort of liberal ideology, intersectionality, and stuff like that. And that book I found so useful in understanding the world outlook of dialectics and Marxism. And I think it's one of the best books out there in terms of learning both the philosophy and the history.
When I first got interested in Marxism, I remember I printed out a list from Wikipedia. That Wikipedia was kind of new back then, and I printed out a list of American Marxists, and I went to Barnes and Noble. And I think it was actually before Barnes and Noble. There used to be another store called Borders. It's closed down. It was a chain. And there was a Borders store, and it was like, maybe 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes away from my house. I got to go there, and it was a car trip, a Saturday car trip. And, the woman behind the counter had like nose piercings and tattoos. It was kind of the kind of people that used to work in quote unquote record stores, back in the days of CDs. And I remember I handed her this list, and I said, do you have anything by any of these American Marxists? And like the first name at the top of the list, it was in alphabetical order, was Martin Aburn. And she just went down like through the A's, through the B's, nothing. So they finally got to the C's, and it was Noam Chomsky. She's like, yeah, we have that guy. And she took me over to the Noam Chomsky section and like ran away from me as fast as she could. So I didn't make her do any more of the names on the list. It was kind of funny. And so, but yeah, if you go to it, back then, really the only Marxist you could find at the Barnes and Noble or Borders was Noam Chomsky. Now I think you probably find Slavoj Žižek, probably. And I think maybe there might be a chance you could find some Richard Wolff, maybe, right? I think some of Richard Wolff or maybe some Verso Press books. But yeah, it's very slim pickings. If you're going to find postmodernism, you're not going to find these very down-to-earth texts that taught people Marxism back when the communist movement was very, very strong in another age. So yeah, I mean, these kind of books are rare treasures. When I discovered them, mainly in libraries and stuff, it was really a great breakthrough in my political development. And I think a lot of the people that are deeply confused about Marxism all over the internet saying weird stuff, it's because they didn't read these textbooks. They just, cracked open Marx and they listened to their postmodern professor tell them what it meant. And now they have confused ideas that, Marxism just means socialism is just an employee stock ownership program or something. They don't understand the concept of a planned economy and such. And I think that's a result of the miseducation people get.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And even just looking at the books, I was telling Ofelia the other day, Ofelia, my girlfriend, who's also a co-editor of Anticonquista, that you can tell the political ideology of leftist books just by looking at the cover sometimes. Like a lot of the pro-Trotsky or pro-West communist books have like these fancy covers and this nice book jacket with the photos. And then you look at the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and it's super modest. It's not anything fancy. The paper, like the copy that I have, it's still in pretty good condition. But when I read it, I made sure to carefully read it because it's the kind of material that's very, it can break easily. And leading up to the second book that I thought would be good to share with everybody is a similar book to the history of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It's called Dialectical Materialism by V.G. Afanasyev. I'm sorry if I'm butchering that name. It's a Soviet book. It's sort of like a textbook as well, and it was published by, I believe, International Publishers in 1987, and it's published by Viktor Grigorovich Afanasyev, a Soviet scientist writing about dialectics. And I wanted to share one line that I find really inspiring from the book, and it's super hard to find. I think you can find it online somewhere. But again, this is the kind of Marxist knowledge that is purposefully hidden from a lot of us, from a lot of young people, that you're not going to find in Barnes and Noble, that it's really hard to find, because this is really the root of Marxism as a scientific outlook. And unfortunately, what the postmodernists have put out there what they brand as Marxism is very different from what we see in the original text. And so, in the introduction of the book to the reader, the writer says, quote, knowledge of Marxist philosophy is essential for progressive young people in all countries because it helps them to gain political maturity and cultivate integrity, staunchness, and courage in the struggle against national and social oppression. Without these qualities, it is impossible to build a bright future. Life repudiates all sorts of nihilistic ideological conceptions invented in the West, according to which we are now witnessing either the general decline in the role and significance of philosophy and ideology in the system of scientific cognition, or the automatic removal of all ideological problems and precepts by the very course of scientific and technical progress, the mathematization of science and the introduction of cybernetics and modeling challenges, or the inability of Marxist philosophy to meet the, quote, challenge of new successes. In actual fact, the very nature of philosophical knowledge rules out such assessments because it is rooted in the requirements of social development. Philosophical knowledge is not a fruit of idle reflections of dilettantes, but a form of social consciousness which reflects the advances of scientific and social progress. And so that was just one part of the book that talks about the importance of philosophy, because I don't know about you, Caleb, but when I was in college in studying politics and other areas of subjects, there was this over mathematization. This is a tongue twister for me. Mathematization, or the empirical vulgarization of studies. So, like in political science, if you take a political science course, everything is models, everything is game theory. It's super calculated and it's based on empiricism. And I think what's beautiful about this book, the dialectical materialism book, is that it shows you how to critique that, not from a point of view where you're just destroying, where you're just destroying bourgeois liberal thought, but you're combating it with a socialist viewpoint of contradiction, of matter and motion. And so I think this book is really cool.
Yeah. Dialectical materialism, which someone told me years ago they had to watch like anti-communist propaganda films in school, and that they would never say dialectical materialism. They would say communists believe in diamats. And it like sounded like George Orwell or something, like the diamats. And they would never explain what it was. They would just say communists, they don't believe in religion. They have this belief called diamats. I think that's hilarious. But, it made it sound like a sci-fi movie or something, But yeah, I mean, I have many times been asked, just explain what dialectical materialism is. And I do. And people go, oh, and people assume it's a really, really complex concept that they couldn't possibly understand. But it's not. I mean, it's all that exists in the world is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of motion, right? That's a pretty basic concept. It's it's Hegel and dialectics. Change comes through contradiction and struggle, right? And it's Greek materialism as opposed to idealism. I mean, it's pretty basic stuff, but people look at it and think it's something they couldn't possibly understand. They hear that word dialectical materialism and they go, oh boy, I can't get this. It's kind of weird how these things have worked. What you said before about the book covers is interesting. It's an interesting point, but I feel like that's something we could do better about. We as a movement. It's very true, right? The flashy covers are always the Trotsky books, and they're always, and it's always the fancy publishing company that puts out a bunch of, a crock of garbage that makes sense to nobody. Whereas the clear Marxist literature always has very, very bland covers. I know a lot of people who have old books from China, the Chinese Beijing Foreign Language Press, and those covers that are just completely bland. Like, have you seen that? I mean, it's just words. It's like tan, you know what I mean? And it's just words, and it's like, it's because it's about the book. It's not about like marketing it and all of that. But I feel like we could do better on that, but there you go. But yeah, which brings me to another book, my second book. I have the new edition of it here, History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. I've often recommended this as the most important book in my political development. I never learned as much as I learned from reading this book. I read it my sophomore year of college. I discovered it, and I was reading it during the financial crisis, 2009, 2010, and it was really big in kind of changing my worldviews, and really getting me to understand Marxism. I feel like until then, I viewed Marxism almost as a religion. It was like I viewed it as like it was like, we're going to have the correct line, right? We're going to have the magical correct line. And if we say the right magical correct words, and we have the correct line, then we'll lead the revolution. And I didn't understand how contradictory forces play out. And the section in this book about Karl Marx and his role in the American Civil War really blew my mind and really educated me. But also the section in here about Karl Marx's polemics with the anarchists was very, very important, as well as the section about the fall of the Second International and Edward Bernstein's revisionism. That was also very big. I mean, this book really kind of showed me the Marxist movement and how it developed, right? And it's funny because if you read the writings of Lenin, if you read the writings of Marx, if you read, histories and stuff, they always make reference to the International, the Second International and all that. People don't know what it is. And a lot of people read Lenin and he's always talking about the Second International as a stinking corpse and the fall of this, but people don't even know what the Second International is. And that's really a tragedy that people don't know what it is, because it's still around. And DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, that's the U.S. wing of the Second International. Now, I believe at this point they only have observer status. I don't think that they're full members. I think they did vote to pull out for some reason, but they're technically a Second International development. The first international was Karl Marx, the International Working Men's Association, and it got taken over by anarchists, and Karl Marx fought with the anarchists, and it was eventually dissolved. The Second International was started in Germany, and the Social Democratic Party of Germany was the first major party. It was the biggest Marxist party in the world. But the British Labour Party of today, major party in Britain, Second International, right? The French Socialist Party, Second International. All over the world, social democratic parties, labor parties were formed as part of something called the Second International. And they sold out, and they supported World War I, and they made Marxism into a reformist, non-revolutionary ideology. So when the Bolsheviks took power in Russia, they started the Third International. And the Third International was technically dissolved during World War II, but it's still around, basically. The International Conference of Communist and Workers' Parties that happens every 4 years, that's basically the Third International, right? It's not as unified. They have a lot more differences of viewpoint. But there's also the World Festival of Youth and Students that happens. That's the youth organizations of the Third International. There's the International Women's Democratic Federation. And that's basically women's organizations of the Third International. And the World Federation of Trade Unions, that's trade unions of the Third International. The Third International is still around. The Second International is still around. I guess there's anarchists that are still the First International. So if you want to understand the Marxist movement as it developed, right? I mean, in Trotsky, what are Trotskyists? They're always forming a Fourth International, right? The Trotskyists are always trying to. There's about 12 different Fourth Internationals. So if you want to understand the Marxist movement, you need to understand the history of the three internationals. But I want to also draw attention to the author, William Z. Foster, because William Z. Foster is probably the greatest Marxist in the history of the United States. And he was a pivotal figure. He was a household name during the 1930s, during the 1940s, and during the 1950s. And nobody did more than him to build the Communist Party USA. And before he was a leader of the Communist Party USA, he was a leader of the Steel Workers Union. He led the Steel Workers Strike of 1919 that shut the country down, where the National Guard was sent to multiple states to put it down. And Woodrow Wilson called him to the White House and urged him to call the strike off. And he told the story, William Z. Foster, of how when Woodrow Wilson met with him at the White House, Woodrow Wilson assumed, because William Z. Foster was a steel worker and was a member of the Steel Workers Union, that he must be stupid. So Woodrow Wilson, who was this PhD with political science and all that, he met with William Z. Foster and spoke to him in roughneck talk, what he called it, trying to speak in a way this ignorant worker could understand. Like, this here strike, Mr. Foster, is hurting our economy. Now, and it was just like, he would do an impression of Woodrow Wilson talking down to him. And that was like, William Z. Foster is very clever. And I would recommend any book by William Z. Foster, really, any book that he wrote. His autobiography, Pages from a Worker's Life, is very good. His book Towards Soviet America, which was his 1932 presidential campaign book explaining what the Communist Party advocated in 1932, is very good. He wrote 5 history volumes: the history of the World Trade Union movement, the history of the Communist Party USA, the history of the African American people of America. He wrote amazing stuff. And he was such a good speaker, such a good writer, and he could speak so clearly. He just had a real talent for things. And he was always a little bit to the left of his own party. And his final years, William Z. Foster actually shouted down Khrushchev. He was in the Soviet Union in 1961, recovering from his illness. I mean, he was 80 years old. And for his birthday, they brought Khrushchev to the hospital to have a photo op with him. And from his hospital bed, William Z. Foster started going on about how great Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution was, and basically calling out Khrushchev for the Sino-Soviet split. And when he died, Khrushchev didn't even show up at the memorial when they buried him in Moscow, at the funeral in Moscow. Brezhnev showed up, but Khrushchev wouldn't show up because he'd been offended by how pro-Mao William Z. Foster was. William Z. Foster was a dynamic leader of the Communist Party USA. I mean, he was the face of American Marxism, and he was a working class guy. And I mean, anything by him I recommend. But his History of the Three Internationals is probably the book that has done the most to educate me about Marxism. So that's the book I would give my full endorsement to. Probably, if you forget every other book we talk about on here, remember this one. I would recommend this.
I actually haven't read that book, and it's on my list because it's one that I've seen you talk really highly about as well in your lives. And I think I'm really curious to learn more about William Z. Foster because
here's the first edition, by the way. Sorry to interrupt. go on.
Oh, that's cool. Wow.
Yeah, we have a first edition here too. So there you go.
Wow.
Go on. Yeah.
No, that's cool. I've been meaning to get it because, to be honest with you, I don't really know much about William Z. Foster, but I'm curious to know what his connections are with other communists internationally, especially in Latin America. For example, in that time period, I don't know, when did he die again?
He died in 1961.
1961. So it's like in the lead up to that, like in Central America, there was the Communist Party of Central America, Farabundo Martí and Augusto Sandino. Farabundo Martí actually traveled to New York once and met with people in the Anti-Imperialist League. And I'm curious to know about if William Z. Foster in any way was connected with Latin American communists, for example, Jose Carlos Mariátegui in Peru. I don't think he actually traveled to the U.S., but I always try to think about communist history in that way, is like who were the contemporaries of that time period and who they interacted with.
Well, he wrote a book called The Outline Political History of the Americas, which is the history of North, South, and Central America from a communist perspective. And I mean, it was published in like 1951, so it doesn't have like the Cuban Revolution and all this amazing stuff. It ends like right before any of that stuff starts. But that book is very, very good. And it's probably, that book was a big influence on Howard Zinn, because Howard Zinn was a member of the Communist Party USA when that book was published. So Howard Zinn was in his 20s, and that you know, that book probably influenced him. But one of the things that Foster, he makes this point in this book as well, but he makes it really hard in the Outline Political Histories of the Americas, is that Earl Browder, who was the leader of the Communist Party USA, who was like William Z. Foster's rival, was like his enemy, Earl Browder. One of the things Earl Browder did was during World War II, Earl Browder changed the position of the Communist Party to be that U.S. imperialism was progressive in Latin America because it was anti-fascist. And on that basis, the Communist Party USA refused to work with Juan Perón and argued that Peronists and nationalists in Latin America who were anti-communist were actually fascists, and that the U.S. imperialists were progressive in overthrowing them and working against them. And in William Z. Foster's writing, he talks about how that's vulgar revisionism, that U.S. imperialism is always the main enemy. And that was something that, because of the Popular Front alliance with American imperialism against the Nazis during World War II, Earl Browder took that so far that in Latin America it was starting to play a negative role. And that also Earl Browder had abandoned independence for Puerto Rico. And when Earl Browder was kicked out, when they had their final fight, as the Second World War was ending, William Z. Foster and Earl Browder had their final fight, and Earl Browder was kicked out of the Communist Party. He had already dissolved the Communist Party and called it the Communist Political Association. Actually, it wasn't even a party; it was a political association. It was basically part of the Democrats. When Foster and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and the rank and file membership and a lot of their black leaders like Claudia Jones and others, when they kicked out Earl Browder, one of the things that they did was to reestablish the call for the independence of Puerto Rico, and to emphasize support for anti-imperialists in Latin America who may not be communists, and the need for an anti-imperialist united front. He writes a lot about that. And all the big history books that he wrote in the 50s have an attack on Browderism in it. And they talk about the anti-Browder campaign. And that was a really big, essential part of Foster's life, because, Foster was the best organizer, the best speaker, the best writer, the labor leader. But Earl Browder was this corrupt, bureaucratic politician who had just really, really just corrupted the Communist Party and really wanted to kind of make the Communist Party into just kind of a wing of the Democratic Party, just do whatever Roosevelt and the Democrats wanted. And Foster couldn't stand him. And so, he always emphasizes that in any of his books that came out after the refoundation of the Communist Party in 1945, he always goes after Browder on like every front. I mean, one of Browder's positions was that black people were not a nation. And William Z. Foster, up until the end, maintained black people were a nation. And that's interesting because the Communist Party continued to publish his writings even after they dropped that position and they no longer supported black nationalism. But Foster was an ardent supporter of black nationalism, which I think is fascinating. So
yeah, that's really cool. To be honest with you, I don't know much about him, but he's one of the people that I've been really meaning to read more about. Mm-hmm. So another book that I wanted to share with you all is this book called Destacamento Rojo. It's called Red Detachment in Spanish, and it's by a Honduran author named Ramon Amaya Amador, who was one of the founders of the Honduran Communist Party in the 1950s. And it basically tells the story of the founding, Red Detachment, the founding of the Communist Party of Honduras, from the point of view of banana workers. And basically, along the coast of Honduras in the north, there are a lot of fruit companies like Dole, back in the day United Fruit, which is now Chiquita Banana. And on that whole coastline were a lot of U.S. companies and U.S. businessmen who went to Honduras, set up plantations, and sold the bananas to the U.S. and internationally, and made a huge profit from it. And the context is interesting, going back to that time period of the 50s, right? Because I remember maybe a few days ago you mentioned on your live that after World War II, the communists were looking really good, right? They defeated fascism. They had led the biggest industrialization in the world to that point. They were already talking about going into space and doing all these amazing things. And this book, it talks about really poor banana workers in Honduras, which is, obviously a third world country, very impoverished, who look at the Soviet Union and they want to build that in Honduras. And so it's cool to see that connection, because a lot of times, like, the view that we get of the Soviet Union comes from, Europe or the US or other countries. And this book provides a view of the Soviet Union in a positive light from the global South, from people who have experienced capitalism and imperialism their whole life. And it's in the context, it takes place in 1954. In 1954, on May Day, there was the biggest strike in Honduran history, where basically they shut down the entire country. This is around the same time period as the U.S.-backed coup against Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, which is right next door. And it's a beautiful story because in the book, the workers also go on strike in solidarity with people in Guatemala who had been resisting the U.S. coup, I think, which was called Operation PB Success, to overthrow Arbenz. And it's an interesting book as well because it goes into it's a novel, so it's told in a story kind of way. It's not like a textbook. But what I find interesting is that the writer, he kind of, through the characters and through the plot, he critiques the two deviations on the left that can be dangerous to a communist movement. One being ultra-leftism. There's characters in here who are Maoists who say, we or not necessarily Mao. They're the ones who are saying, like, the Soviet Union is bad. We need to be more radical than them. We need to be even more intense. And in the book, those are the people who end up getting contracted by United Fruit to oppose the strike led by the Marxist-Leninists, and they eventually end up like the banana owners, the plantation owners end up getting them drunk, end up getting information about the strike and destabilize the movement. And it reminds me of when you talk about counter gangs in your lives, how they use people who are like, oh, those are phonies. They're not real radicals. We need the real revolutionaries. And then it also showed the right deviation. It showed the people who worked with the Partido Liberal, the Liberal Party, who wanted to just reform. And so it takes the main character is this guy called Rotundo Garcia, who is a Marxist-Leninist, and he's one of the main leaders of the Communist Party. And it's such a good book. And for me personally, it's beautiful because it's a communist book, but it's also a Honduran book. And in Honduras, compared to a lot of other countries, because of its level of impoverishment, these kind of books are very hard to find. We don't have our own independent publishing houses the way like Mexico or Argentina, for example, has, where they have a very long history of literary tradition and books and leftism. And in Honduras, unfortunately, a lot of Ramon Amaya Amador himself actually had to flee. He went to Czechoslovakia, he went to the Soviet Union, he frequently traveled the Soviet region. And so I think it's a really cool book for anyone who's interested in like Latin America and the 1950s when communism was like a really threatening and exciting thing.
Okay, great. Well, the last book that I wanted to talk about is actually an autobiography or a memoir, and it's called Black Radical by Nelson Peary. And it's not as widely acclaimed. Nelson Peary, he wrote 2 autobiographical books. His first one was called Black Fire, and that was his story of growing up in Minnesota, and his family was kind of around the Communist Party as an African-American worker and stuff. But this book, Black Radical, is the second of his autobiographies, and it comes out. It begins his life when he came home from World War II, and he fought against Japan in the Philippines during World War II and such. And he comes home and he talks about his experience as a black man who joins the Communist Party USA right after the Second World War and what it was like. And it is amazing. He's giving analysis of the U.S. economy and the black community and things that are changing while he's describing fights in the Communist Party and McCarthyism. And it is amazing in so many ways. Like, it begins by, I didn't know this, but right after World War II, there was a lynching wave in the United States of black men in military uniforms because so many black men had fought against, the fascists in Japan or in Germany. And the racists were like offended by the sight of a black man in a military uniform. So all over the United States, black men were lynched because they were wearing their military uniforms, right? I had no idea, but it was like a widespread lynching wave all over the country following the Second World War. I mean, just horrendous stuff, right? And that's the atmosphere in which he joins the Communist Party because he sees them as the anti-racist organization, the organizers of the Civil Rights Congress, which was the main anti-racist group at that point. So in the book, he describes joining the Communist Party, and he describes how the Smith Act trials. I mean, the Communist Party was illegal in 1948. They basically declared the Communist Party to be illegal under the U.S. federal government. So he went underground, right? Because he was African American. Many African Americans didn't have birth certificates back then. So he was able to go to the Social Security office and say he didn't have a birth certificate and get a completely different name. And so he gets a different name, and he goes into hiding. And he's hiding. And once a week, he goes to a public library and meets somebody from the Communist Party who gives him, like, his information. So he's, like, living underground. And he describes that experience and what it's like when he's, like, living underground. And the Communist Party USA developed this, like, underground apparatus during the McCarthy period because it was illegal. And he talks about how they had this law they had passed back then. It's on the books, but the Supreme Court has kind of overruled most of it. The McCarran Internal Security Act that would put communists in concentration camps at a time of national emergency. And so, like, he talked about, they thought that the USA was, like, becoming Nazi Germany during the McCarthy period. So, he's in the Communist Party, he's underground, and he describes what it was like to be underground in the Communist Party and how they just kind of lost him at some point. Like, whoever he was supposed to go meet just stopped showing up for the meetings every Saturday. And so he was just kind of lost and he didn't know what was going on. And then he describes how 1957, the Supreme Court ruled that it was legal for the Communist Party to exist. They ruled that the Communist Party could exist as long as they didn't advocate violence. So the Communist Party was suddenly legal again. So he just shows up at their convention and they're reformed, but that's just after the secret speech by Khrushchev. And so he's in the middle of that fight. And he talks about how he and the Puerto Rican and black members didn't like Khrushchev and were pro-Mao and pro-Soviet. And eventually, he's kicked out and he forms something called the Provisional Organizing Committee, and he's trying to form a new communist party that's more like Maoist. And he talks about then moving out to the West Coast and his organizing in Watts and the Watts Rebellion that took place. And he describes how he formed what was eventually, it was first called the California Communist League. and eventually became the Communist Labor Party, which was an attempt to build like a kind of a Maoist kind of communist group. But his group, unlike most of the Maoist groups, was majority African American, and he describes it. It's a very, very good book, and there's so much detail and so much analysis. And he's telling you his life story while he's describing these big events that are happening around the country. It's really, if you want a story from somebody who was on the front lines of the communist movement in the 50s and early 60s, I mean, this is the book. I wish he had lived to write another edition, because this ends in like the mid 60s, right? And so much more. I mean, this guy had so much more of a life after that in the 70s and 80s, but he didn't live. He died recently. So, but yeah, I mean, this book, I've read it 3 times now. I mean, I've learned so much from Nelson Fury. Black Radical by Nelson Fury is a really, really good book. And it's anti-imperialist, it's Marxist, it's a powerful, powerful book if you want to understand the Marxist movement in the United States.
That's really cool. And California has an interesting history of socialism and communism. I mean, when I moved out here a few years ago, I didn't really expect to see so much history about communism. But here in Los Angeles, there's a big history of communists, especially with the Chicano movement, and in the Bay Area, in Oakland, with the Black Liberation movement. And what do you find interesting about California? Because I know you had mentioned to me when you were out here before that you thought it was interesting as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, McCarthyism and in Hollywood, and how influential the Communist Party was in Hollywood at one point, and how many prominent writers and artists and intellectuals were aligned with the Communist Party, but also the Communist Party's role in organizing, Chicano workers. You can read like, Grapes of Wrath and Tannery Row, and like John Steinbeck is writing about the amazing work the Communist Party is doing and organizing some of, not just very famous writers and movie stars, but also some of the poorest people in the country at that point, and it seemed like, that in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, even up into the 60s and 70s, the Communist Party USA had a really big influence in Southern California. I know that for a long time, the leader of the Communist Party of California was a woman named Dorothy Healy. And she eventually quit and became a social democrat in like the 70s. But she was very, very prominent and powerful. And that it was, and in Oakland, a lot of people don't know that in Oakland, California, in 1946, right after the Second World War, the Communist Party organized a general strike in Oakland, California. It's one of the general strikes that's forgotten. But, the ILWU, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, that's a communist. That's a communist union. I mean, it was built by the Communist Party in the 1934 strike, and they had a one-day strike to free the Rosenbergs. They refused to unload ships from South Africa in opposition to apartheid. They even shut down the docks for symbolic strikes against the war in Iraq. I mean, they are very much a radical union built by the Communist Party USA. If you look at their history, I mean, there's so much amazing stuff. I got to get out to California again. I'm planning to get out there in the fall. Fingers crossed, we're gonna, if the pandemic and everything goes right, goes wrong, I guess, or however you want to put it, we're gonna be out there doing an event, pretty soon, because I mean, California, it's an amazing place with so much history. And the free speech movement at Berkeley. I mean, that's an amazing moment. Kind of, you read about that, where they were banning students at Berkeley from having any organizing on campus about off-campus issues. So some people set up a literature table for the Progressive Labor Party, which was like a Maoist group, and the police came to arrest them. And so then all the students sat on top of the police car and like held the police car hostage, and set up a microphone on top of the police car, and they had like a speak out on top of the police car. 1963, the free speech movement at Berkeley. So much stuff has gone on in California. It's fascinating. But as you pointed out to me many times, California is also ground zero for the synthetic left. And there's a lot of that, BS, hippy dippy counterculture, non-materialist, CIA-funded, drug-induced, that kind of leftism also has a huge influence in California. And that's probably not an accident. That was probably to offset the influence that was there because of the communists, wouldn't you say?
Oh yeah, it's definitely true. And out here, anarchism unfortunately is very popular. I mean, I don't want to like just go critique anarchism all day. I think there's a lot of good anarchists and are principled anarchists. But it's the trendy thing out here, especially because of the punk culture. Like what I find really interesting is like out here with a lot of young people, punk culture, punk rock is very popular. abolish everything, be against everything. And to be for something, to be in favor of something is seen as kind of corny or old fashioned. And that's something that I think, maybe through conversations like these, going back to our history as communists, to look at essential works, I think it's something that we can change because in Los Angeles, for example, there are so many groups that are against gentrification, against police brutality, which are all good things, but you rarely see any events in solidarity with, for example, with Venezuela, in solidarity with Syria. And that's one of the things I have noticed slightly difference between New York and Los Angeles. I don't know if it's because of the makeup of the city or diversity, but I definitely see here more. Here I see more of a critique of like quote unquote tankies. There's a lot of like anti-Syria sentiment, a lot of anti-Iran sentiment, a lot of anti-Russia sentiment. And I don't know if Hollywood has to deal with it or the layout of the city, but it's something that we struggle with all the time out here.
Well, there's a lot of Iranian exiles in Los Angeles, right? I mean, the Shah's family, right? They're out there. I mean, that's right. The Shahs of Sunset or whatever. I mean, that's where they're operating out of. And but yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating to me. And I think we had a good conversation here. I hope people check out the books we recommended. I hope people check out Anti-Conquista. You, Ophelia, and others put out great content. You really do, and you do some great interviews. So yeah, anything further, Ramiro, before we wrap this up?
I just want to mention this is one book I haven't read yet. I'm going to
Okay.
start reading. I suggested to everybody Xi Jinping, The Governance of China. I know Caleb has also shouted out. And I actually got this in China, in Beijing. I was visiting last year with Ophelia. And I mean, I haven't read it yet, like I said, but just quickly glancing over it, the language and the things that Xi Jinping writes about are 100% Marxist. People have this understanding, this view that Xi Jinping is just like a capitalist, that he's right wing, that the Communist Party of China is socialist in name only. But the stuff that he's talking about here, even just looking at the subtitles, he's talking about dialectics, he's talking about human advancement, progress, and one of the key features of the book is the idea that you mentioned as well in your lives is the fact that as Marxists, as communists, we have to be forward looking and look at the long game. And in the governance of China, from what I've seen so far, it's like he's talking about 50-year plans, 100-year plans, and how to bring. And he talks about the one line that I found really beautiful is he says the Chinese dream is the people's dream. It's not just for the Chinese people, but for around the world, and not in a way of like trying to export the Chinese socialist model, but in the sense of win-win cooperation, of international friendship. And although it's not trendy among the synthetic left to praise China and defend China, the works that are coming out from Xi Jinping, his speeches, his books, The Governance of China, is really inspirational. So if you're looking for inspirational modern day 21st century socialist writings, definitely pick up The Governance of China because it's happening now. Literally, it's happening now. Millions of people are being lifted out of poverty. And so that's one book I'm really looking forward to reading.
Yeah, and I made a video about that book. There's two volumes of it now. There's volume 1 and volume 2, and there'll probably be more as he gives more speeches and writes more articles and such. That what surprises me is that there's so little interest in it. Because I would think that China is it's 1/5 of the world's population at this point. It's a huge country, and it's like I would think that if you were interested in Marxism, maybe you don't agree with China, you don't like it or whatever, but you would at least want to hear their side of the story. Because this is a huge country led by a Marxist party, and I just don't understand why that book isn't being widely studied, even if by people who disagree with it. And that's the weird thing is you'd think that even people who don't like China, it's really common in left-wing circles in the United States, people to just dismiss China, write it off, China's no good. Well, maybe they ought to read the book and discover where they're wrong, at least, right? I mean, I see so little interest in engaging. When you have the president of China putting out Marxist books and Marxist publications, you would think people want to read what he's saying and figure out, is he wrong, is he right? But it's like it doesn't exist. It's just been kind of written out. One thing that I thought was neat was it was either China Daily or the Global Times or one of the Chinese publications put out kind of a graphic of President Xi Jinping's book list. And it's like his favorite books. And not all of them are Marxist books, but there's some key works by Karl Marx on the list. There's works by Lenin that are on the list. But there's also, works by, works of fiction, classical literature. It's actually a pretty neat list of books, President Xi's favorite reading list, and people should check it out. I don't have it in front of me, so I can't read you everything that's on the list, but it's pretty neat. And that's what he's encouraging people to read. And a lot of party members are reading every book on that list because that's kind of what the Chinese Communist Party thinks people should read. So I think it's fascinating. And China really is a source of inspiration to me. And again, that's kind of what I got from the history of the Three Internationals. When I read about Karl Marx's support for Abraham Lincoln, that helped me to understand that, when there was a civil war in the United States between the slaveholders and the northern industrialists, Karl Marx didn't just declare, oh, okay, well, I'm for communism. What good would that have done, right? That's not scientific, right? That when there's an actual conflict in a country, the role of Marxists is to find their way into that conflict and play a role in one side of the contradiction. Lincoln wasn't a communist. Lincoln wasn't a socialist. He wasn't a Marxist or a revolutionary. But because of the fact that he was fighting the slaveholders, he had to align with the working class. And he had to build a mass movement among the working class to defeat the slaveholders, as part of his own self-interest. And in doing that, a lot of amazing things happened, like the early labor movement got going, that small farmers were fighting for their rights in a lot of cases, and that the later upsurge that they called the populists that came after the Civil War, the People's Party that was formed, was largely people who'd been brought into motion by Abraham Lincoln, and his mobilization against the slaveholders. And then when the Republican Party became an imperialist party and kind of moved away from the more revolutionary stuff that Lincoln was talking about, they continued to be revolutionary and radical. And the populist movement, the free silver movement and such, that movement that eventually gave birth to the American Marxist movement. The American Marxist movement was part of that current. And you read about Henry George, the economist who called for the nationalization of all land and all of this. I mean, the Marxists, they didn't just stand on the sidelines and declare both sides are phony. They found existing social forces, they made strategic alliances, and they got things done. And that's how Marxists have always operated. That's what makes Marxists different from the utopian socialisms that preceded Marxism. So, that's what I recommend people do. And one more book I'll mention, I don't have it with me, unfortunately, but I'll just mention, if you want to read a good book about Marxism, read City Builders and Vandals by Caleb Maupin.
I got that in my shelf.
Yeah, and it's gotten a lot of very good reviews. A lot of people say it's very introductory. It gives kind of a basic introduction to Marxism and stuff like that. And I know some people are even planning some classes on the book around the country, book reading groups around City Builders and Vandals. It's in public libraries in Australia. People are reading it in Venezuela. A number of copies are being studied in Venezuela. From what I understand, there is a translation into Italian in the works, as well as a translation into German in the works, as well as a translation into Spanish that's currently in the works. So, I mean, the book has created quite a stir. It's not, it's certainly not, it's not getting all the play that like a Slovoj Žižek book would create, but among leftist circles, among people that consider themselves to be quote unquote tankies, it's something that everyone's reading. I mean, whenever I check the number of copies sold, my jaw drops. I'm like, is this for real? I want to meet these people. Like, who's buying this book? You know what I mean? I find it shocking, but people continue to order the book. So it's made a stir. Have you read any of City Builders and Vandals?
I read the whole book. I was actually in Honduras when I was reading it, and
Okay.
it was cool because I was talking about the book with a lot of people out there that I was, just not even political people or leftist people, and I was talking about the concept of the book, and they were like, "Wow, that's so needed because so much," and even they were saying it too. They were like, all these kids want to do is just protest, and tear down, and we want stability, we want growth, we want development, and we want to bring that constructive aspect back to socialism. And people definitely like the book, and I think even getting a copy like in Spanish or something sometime would be good.
Yeah, well, we're working on a translation because delegations have brought it to Venezuela, and the Venezuelan folks have read it, and it's being studied in Latin America for sure. So we need to get a Spanish edition very soon, and it's in the works right now. And we're going to be putting out a kind of a revised edition of it very soon as well, because the text as it is, it's a little rough. So we're going to fix it up a little bit. There should be a new edition that'll be available very, very shortly. But yeah, I mean, exciting times we live in, but books are important. People want to say, oh, books aren't important. No, they're very, very important, right? Yeah, ideas are very, very important. As much as we're we're protesting and we're out in the streets sometimes, but the battle of ideas and what is it all for and all of that is something that's also very, very important in historical events. So thank you so much, Ramiro. It's always a pleasure to interact with you anytime. Check out Anticonquista. Great stuff on there. And subscribe to Anticonquista. Subscribe to this channel. Be part of this community, because we're having a growing, exciting community centered around socialism and constructive socialism in our age. So good times. Thank you so much, Ramiro.
Thanks, Caleb. Take care, and whenever you want to come out to LA, you always have a home out here.
Excellent.